Wilson out by 3 on Media Puzzle. I think he's got the cup one. Beatkeeper Mr. Prudent are running on from Benny Rowe, but it's Media Puzzle clear, and Media Puzzle, Damien and Dermot have done it.
One of the things I think a lot of people would be surprised at is the equipment that you use. Probably hasn't changed since Eric Welsh was over the back using a set of binoculars from the pub trying to call into the racecourse. Talk a little bit about the equipment that you have. Has it changed that much since you were first calling back in the late 70s or 80s?
Principally, no. It's just a tripod and a stand and a swivel that will help the binoculars just move nice and comfortably, and that really hasn't altered in our lifetimes. What has changed is television. Now, the Melbourne Cup broadcaster has the camera right in front of him, the TV monitor right in front of him. And I've tried very hard to call a lot off that TV monitor because the majority of the audience is watching those pictures. It's difficult to do because you still need to switch between the binoculars and the TV monitor. So it's a lot easier when the TV monitor's not there, when you don't have to integrate it in the call. But that's been the change. That's a big challenge for Matthew now. It was just towards the end of my career. But principally, to answer the question, principally, it's the old 10 by 50s or the 15 by 60 binoculars that Eric Welsh and Bert Bright and Bill Collins and Joe Brown used to use.
I suppose the only other difference too on Melbourne Cup Day was you might have to screw it in a little bit tighter. Does it get a bit shakier?
No doubt about that. That's, we've all been asked questions about the Cup over the years, and for me, from Chiquita Lodge to the home turn, when horses, that's when they make their runs, and that's when, to hold those glasses steady. And the one thing, and Greg and I were part of this, we did get bigger binoculars, and I think Bill was the first one to do it, wasn't he, Greg?
At 88.
So we went from those 10 by 40s to 15 by 60s, and they made a difference because they're a long way away. But from the Chiquita Lodge to the home turn is the moving time in the Melbourne Cup. It's when horses are either tiring or making their runs and hard to see. And I found, for the few that I did, that my hands would shake. It was hard not to. Yeah. So that was the trick, wasn't it?
That half an hour before the Melbourne Cup, that's when the knot in your stomach just tightens up and you can't wait for the jockeys to get on the horses and go to the start. And when the gates open, it's like, oh, thank goodness. It's a job of work to be done now. The lead up to it, if you don't control the nerves and have yourself really settled before the jump, then it can unravel for you. So that's the hardest part of calling the Melbourne Cup, is just controlling things before the gates open.
I agree with that. I think it'd be a little bit like a grand final call and the build-up, and as soon as the opening bounce takes place and the rover gets the ball and you've nailed that player, I think when the gates open and you name a horse and you identify a horse, you know you're on your way.
You're just so well prepared and you're so focused for it that you feel, in a sense, you're invincible, because if you weren't, you would be having trepidation about being in that position in the first place. So once you grasp that you are that right person to be in that position to call that race, you feel like you can conquer everything. I mean, I'm sure we'll all agree, we'd much prefer a field of 24 in a Melbourne Cup than a field of 3. I mean, I don't know if people out there would know how challenging calling a 3-horse race would be. But with 24, there's one thing about a big field. There's always going to be something to call. You're not going to run out of things to say or to describe. So I was just so ultra-focused. I wanted... When you complete that challenge of 24 in a race, it's almost like, give me a bigger challenge. You can beat your chest, and if you get through it, okay, you know what I mean? It's, as I said before, it's a bit like conquering Everest. You imagine someone that got to the top of Everest, if they've still got some oxygen in their lungs, they're probably going to use up that last little bit of it. And I think Melbourne Cup is a bit that way, because mentally, if not physically, there is quite a sense of relief.
Oh. You know what? I reckon you should have called in the 40s and 50s, because then you'd have a field
of
had
50
30 in the Melbourne Cup, and then the very next race they'd go to the 6 furlong start and there'd be 40 of them charging at you. You could have that on your own.
Carbine had 39, didn't they, in 1890 or something? That could have been damned.
I should have been born years ago.
But it is only one of 2 times of the year that you can call 24, the Newmarket being the other race. So does that pose a bigger difficulty for you,
in the 80s,
having to learn the extra colours and the numbers?
There was a few more bigger fields. The Newmarkets would traditionally have 24, and they'd split. And even on Melbourne Cup Day, they'd have those the high weights, and that'd often be fields of 24.
There were a lot of big fields back in those days, but
Yeah.
then they've reduced them to 16. Whether it was for, I think the TAB had a fair say in that, the bigger punters had a say in it also, for trifectas, and that was the optimum field size rather than the bigger fields, and that's why they did reduce them. So it's made it a tad easier, but not a lot.
I think it's a combination of... 24 is a challenge, but it's got much more to do with the race itself. The race itself brings on the pressure, not the 24. The 24 is a part of the challenge of calling it, but we all know that we could call 500 races a year superbly and call one poorly, and our reputation's in tatters. Because that's what the race is all about. You could be a brilliant commentator and have one bad day, and that's all that counts, and that's what the Melbourne Cup is. And that's why, you know,
You're so right.
we've been through it all, and we
Yeah.
know that that's our moment.
An entire year gets judged on 10 seconds.
Exactly.
That's it. The final furlong of the Melbourne Cup is what you judge.
It's like Kathy Freeman when she walked out that night. Lost one race in 4 years. But she'd been world champion twice. As she hadn't won in Sydney, she carried a nation on her back. 49 seconds to find her career. Now, we're not Kathy Freemans. She's at a higher level. She's an Olympic champion. But for us, each year, our moment of truth came in this race.
Is it easier to remember or is it easier to forget? What's the harder part in learning the colours?
We've quoted Bill Collins several times already, and I mean, he is the master. And he told me many moons ago, you need a memory like a sieve. So you put all the information in, process it, and forget it. And then fill the sieve up again for race 2 and do the same all day. So you've got to forget as quickly as you remember. So there's a process.
Now, you had a difficult one in your first Cup. There was 6 horses from Lloyd Williams. Does it make it harder because there's 6 different caps, or would you prefer to have had 6 different sets of silks or colours?
Well, I think it certainly makes it a little bit more difficult. In your own mind, you're second-guessing a little bit, and as a result, when you're trying to say the name, it seems to come out a millisecond slower because you're just double-checking in your own mind what horse it is. But I always find with those Lloyd Williams horses, the tricky part is seeing them previously. You might have a horse run in the Lexus on the Saturday, wearing a yellow cap, but then 4 days later runs in the Cup in a red cap. So it's already ingrained. So it's probably harder to forget that than remember its next colour. So yeah, that's the tricky part about having 6 of Lloyd's, but I don't think we're going to solve that problem anytime soon. He seems to be very keen to have plenty of runners.
I think Greg had probably the hardest of them all because maybe your last year or second last year, Greg not only had Lloyd en masse, but he had Godolphin en masse. How many were there?
I think there were 11 or 12, which were principally blue. But worse than that, the caps were repeated. So there was a pink cap on Godolphin and a pink cap on Lloyd's, and a blue cap and a blue cap and a white cap and a white cap. So my last Cup was a disaster. And I did say to them, those in charge and the judge, I said, don't let that happen next year to Matt because it's just too hard.
It wasn't a disaster of a call, though. It was a disaster that they all went out in similar colour. It was a fantastic call. I mean, as race callers, watching and knowing what you had to go through, I mean, it was an exemplary call, Greg.
That's why I stopped. Go out like that.
El Bandon and Heartbreak City. What a finish to the Melbourne Cup. El Bandon putting his nose in front of Heartbreak City. They hit the line. El Bandon won it by a very narrow margin from Heartbreak City.